There is a study that most people in finance have never heard of. It was published in 2022 by researchers at UC Berkeley, and what it found was this. One night of insufficient sleep increases financial risk-taking by approximately 29%, not discomfort, not irritability, not worse mood. Risk-taking, the actual willingness to gamble with money, measured in controlled experiments, using real financial decisions, goes up by nearly a third after a single bad night. 29% is not a rounding error. That is the difference between a considered financial decision and a reckless one. That is the margin between staying in a position and doubling down. Between waiting and spending. Between a plan and an impulse. And the researchers found it not by asking people how they felt. They found it by watching what people actually did, with real money, under real conditions, after their sleep was disrupted. The results were consistent, they were significant, and they have been quietly sitting in the behavioral economics literature for years, barely discussed outside of sleep research circles. The lead researchers were Eddie Ben Simon and Matthew Walker, at the Center for Human Sleep Science at UC Berkeley. Walker is perhaps the most prominent sleep researcher working today. His research has shaped how neuroscience understands the relationship between sleep and almost every domain of human function. And what he and Ben Simon found in this work is that the relationship between sleep and financial decision-making is not metaphorical. It is not about feeling foggy or unmotivated. It is a documented, reproducible alteration in how the brain evaluates risk, values the future, and regulates the impulse to act. To understand why, you have to understand what sleep deprivation actually does to the brain. Not what it feels like, but what it physically changes. The prefrontal cortex is the brain's executive control center. It handles planning. It handles impulse regulation. It handles the capacity to weigh a future consequence against a present temptation. When it is functioning well, it applies what researchers sometimes call a cognitive brake, a friction that slows impulsive decisions and inserts deliberation between impulse and action. Sleep deprivation degrades prefrontal cortex functions significantly, but that is only part of the story. At the same time, the amygdala, the brain's emotional threat and reward detection system, becomes dramatically more reactive. A 2007 study by Els van der Helm and Matthew Walker measured amygdala reactivity under sleep deprivation and found that it increased by approximately 60%. The amygdala began firing more intensely, more frequently, and with less precision than it would in a well-rested brain. So what you get after one insufficient night of sleep is not simply a tired brain. You get a brain with a weakened brake and an overactivated accelerator. The system that says wait has less power. The system that says now has more. In financial terms, this is exactly as dangerous as it sounds. Ben Simon and Walker's 2022 experiments presented participants with a series of financial choices. Between immediate smaller rewards and larger delayed ones. Between risky bets and conservative holds. Between spending and saving. The sleep-deprived participants did not simply perform slightly worse. They made systematically different choices. They chose the immediate reward more often. They took the riskier bet more often. They discounted the future more steeply. This pattern, valuing immediate rewards more and future rewards less after sleep deprivation, has a name in behavioral economics. It is called delayed discounting, and it is one of the most robust predictors of financial difficulty researchers have identified. People with steep delay discounting curves tend to have more debt, more impulsive spending, less savings, and worse long-term financial outcomes across the board. Sleep deprivation steepens that curve. In a brain that has not slept enough, a dollar available now feels more valuable not by a small amount, but by a measurable, significant margin than a larger sum available next week. The future becomes psychologically further away. Consequences feel less real, and the present, the available, the now, the here, feels more urgent and more compelling than it actually is. This is not a matter of willpower, it is a matter of neurochemistry. Sleep regulates the balance of dopamine receptors in the reward circuits of the brain. It modulates serotonin availability in the prefrontal regions that govern inhibitory control. It clears adenosine, the chemical that accumulates during waking hours and produces cognitive fatigue from the synapses that handle executive function. When sleep is insufficient, none of these restoration processes complete properly. The brain that wakes from a bad night is chemically and structurally different from the brain that went to sleep, and not in ways that support good financial decisions. Here is what makes this especially important. Most people who are sleep-deprived do not know how impaired they are. This is one of the most well-documented and counterintuitive findings in sleep research. Subjective sense of alertness. How awake you feel. decouples from objective cognitive performance after several days of insufficient sleep. People who have been sleeping 6 hours a night for 2 weeks report feeling only slightly tired. Cognitive tests show they are performing as badly as someone who has not slept for 24 hours straight. The impairment accumulates. The self-awareness does not. This matters for financial behavior because the conditions under which you make financial decisions, your actual cognitive state may be systematically worse than you believe them to be. A person who has slept 6 hours a night for a week, operating under the impression that they feel fine, is making financial decisions with the cognitive capacity of someone who has pulled an all-nighter, and they do not know it. Now add something else. Add financial worry, because here is where the story becomes a loop rather than a line. Financial stress is one of the leading causes of sleep disruption in adults. Research published in the Journal of Sleep Research and across multiple population studies has consistently found that people with financial concerns report shorter sleep duration, more frequent nighttime awakenings, and lower sleep quality than their financially stable counterparts. The mechanisms are straightforward. Financial worry activates the same threat detection systems, the same cortisol release, the same background cognitive processes that we covered in the research on cognitive bandwidth. And all of these are incompatible with the brain state required for deep, restorative sleep. So the person who is financially stressed sleeps worse. The person who sleeps worse makes more impulsive financial decisions. More impulsive financial decisions increase financial stress. Increased financial stress further disrupts sleep. The loop closes on itself, and with each rotation, the cognitive capacity available to interrupt the cycle decreases. This is not a metaphor for a difficult situation. It is a documented physiological mechanism with specific brain structures, specific neurochemicals, and specific behavioral outputs that have been measured in controlled conditions across dozens of studies. Walker has described this dynamic in his research as one of the most under-recognized compounding effects in the study of economic disadvantage. The people who most need sound financial judgment are often the people whose sleep quality is most disrupted by the conditions that require sound financial judgment in the first place. The structure is the same as the cognitive bandwidth story. The mechanism is different. The cost is additive. Let's stay with the decision-making for a moment, because the sleep research goes further than most people realize. Ben Simon and Walker's work identified not just that sleep-deprived people take more financial risk. They identified that sleep-deprived people show what the researchers called an optimism bias in financial forecasting, when asked to estimate the probability of positive versus negative financial outcomes. Sleep-deprived participants showed a systematic shift toward expecting better outcomes and toward discounting warning signals. This is a specific kind of impairment. It is not just acting impulsively. It is the failure to weight bad news appropriately. A well-rested brain, when presented with a risky financial scenario, engages the prefrontal cortex to evaluate the downside as seriously as the upside. A sleep-deprived brain weights them differently. The potential gain feels more vivid. The potential loss feels more abstract. If you have ever made a financial decision that seemed reasonable at the time, perhaps even exciting, and then looked back at it later rested and wondered what you were thinking, this mechanism is a plausible part of the explanation. Now, there is one more dimension to this that the Rand Corporation put into economic terms in 2016. A research team led by Marco Hafner at Rand Europe calculated the economic cost of sleep deprivation across 5 major economies: the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, and Canada. The methodology was extensive. It included productivity losses, mortality risk increases, and occupational performance decrements associated with chronic insufficient sleep. The number for the United States alone was $401 billion per year. That is not a rounding error either. That is a figure comparable to the GDP of medium-sized economies, and it is generated not by acute sleep deprivation, not by people pulling all-nighters, but by the chronic low-grade sleep insufficiency that affects a large share of the working population. People sleeping 6 hours when they need 7 or 8. People sleeping lightly, waking partially, accumulating what researchers call sleep debt across weeks and months. The workers in the RAND study were not failing catastrophically. They were not visibly impaired. They were functioning, going to work, making decisions, managing finances, while operating at meaningfully below optimal cognitive capacity, without knowing it. The financial decisions made inside this state, investment choices, spending choices, debt management choices, are not being made by the brain at its actual capacity. They are being made by a brain running on insufficient maintenance with a weakened brake, an overactivated accelerator, a steepened delayed discounting curve, and a systematic bias toward optimism about financial risk. And the conditions that most reliably produce this state are not unusual. They are not extreme. They are the ordinary conditions of financial pressure. The worry that does not let you fall asleep, the calculations that run in the background at 2 in the morning, the low-level alertness that keeps sleep shallow, and restoration incomplete. Walker's broader research on sleep in the brain as one finding that is worth staying with as we close. Sleep is not passive. It is not simply the absence of waking activity. It is an active, metabolically expensive process during which the brain performs functions that cannot be performed while awake. It consolidates learning. It clears metabolic waste through the lymphatic system. It processes emotional memories. It restores the neurochemical balance that executive function depends on. It recalibrates the amygdala. It recharges the prefrontal cortex. All of these processes are relevant to financial decision-making. All of them are compromised by insufficient sleep, and all of them are disrupted specifically by the kind of financial worry that is most likely to be present in the brain of a person navigating real financial difficulty. The person who stays up calculating whether they can cover next month's rent is not just losing sleep. They are losing the neurological restoration that would have given them a better chance of making good decisions about next month's rent. The cost is not just the lost hours. It is what does not happen during those hours, and what that failure costs in the decisions made during all the hours that follow. This is the part that most conversations about financial behavior miss entirely. We talk about financial literacy. We talk about budgeting tools. We talk about behavior change, and all of these things have value, but they are after the roar mask off to the man. They are after the roar. And the condition of that brain, how well it slept last night and the night before and the night before that, shapes the cognitive environment in which every piece of financial information is received, evaluated, and acted upon. A person who has slept well for 7 nights in a row is bringing a different brain to their financial decisions than a person who has slept poorly for the same 7 nights. Not a different person, not a different level of intelligence or education or motivation. A different brain, same skull, same wife, same information, but with a 29% higher willingness to take financial risk, a steeper discount of future consequences, and the measurably reduced capacity to apply the cognitive brake to the impulse that just arose. The 29% is not destiny. The loop is not unbreakable, but it cannot be interrupted by information alone, because information that enters a sleep-deprived brain is processed differently from information that enters a well-rested one. The intervention has to include the biological substrate that the decisions are made inside of. Sleep is not a lifestyle preference. It is not a luxury. It is infrastructure. It is the physiological foundation on which every other cognitive function, including every financial function, is built. The brain that makes your financial decisions is not abstract. It is biological. It is chemical. It is affected by what you ate, by whether you moved, by what you are worried about, and by how many hours of genuine, restorative sleep it received last night. And in a life where financial pressure is real, where the worry is real, that last factor may be the one doing more work than any budget spreadsheet ever could. 29%. Not from a bad month, not from a bad year, from a bad night.